Hi there. Tonight, I invite you to listen to the story of Pride and Prejudice, written long ago by Jane Austen. Close your eyes and let us begin. It is quietly accepted, as if whispered from one household to another, that any single gentleman, blessed with a comfortable fortune, must, sooner or later, be in need of a wife. So when Mr. Bingley, a young man of wealth and cheerful spirit, took up residence at Netherfield Park, the news drifted through the countryside like morning mist, settling gently on every tongue. In the modest Bennet household, this news stirred a ripple of excitement. Mrs. Bennet, ever eager for her daughter's future, was certain that one of the five, Jane, Elizabeth, Mary, Kitty, or Lydia, must surely catch Mr. Bingley's eye. Mr. Bennet, in contrast, remained unreadable. He spoke little of it, seemed hardly interested at all. And yet, it was he who quietly paid the first visit to Mr. Bingley, without a word to his family, as though his silence were part of some private amusement. When Mr. Bingley finally appeared at the town's first ball, the air itself seemed to lighten. He was kind, open-hearted, and full of gentle energy. And when he danced more than once with Jane Bennet, the eldest daughter with soft eyes and graceful ways, the room seemed to hold its breath. She was lovely, and he seemed to see it clearly. But Mr. Bingley did not come alone. At his side was Mr. Darcy, taller, more finely dressed, with features sharper and more guarded. There was something in his silence that set him apart. People murmured of his wealth, £10,000 a year, but even that could not warm his demeanor. He spoke little, kept close to Bingley and Bingley's sisters, and barely nodded to the rest. It was during that very evening that Elizabeth Bennet, the second daughter, happened to hear a passing remark. Mr. Darcy, standing just out of earshot, or so he thought, dismissed her with cold precision. "She is tolerable, but not handsome enough to tempt me." The words were careless, tossed like a pebble into still water. Elizabeth, who was rarely wounded by such things, still found them echoing in her thoughts. Not because she cared for Mr. Darcy, she did not, but there was something in his proud, distant manner that stirred a quiet defiance in her heart. And while Darcy remained withdrawn, Bingley grew steadily closer to Jane. Their connection, warm and effortless, began to take shape, and with each passing day, Mrs. Bennet's hopes grew brighter, like a candle burning just a little higher with every flicker of attention. The ball had ended, but its echoes lingered in the quiet countryside, like the soft trail of music after a final note. The Bennet family returned home, each member carrying a private thread of feeling. Mrs. Bennet was alight with hope, the daughters chattered endlessly, and Mr. Bennet, as always, sat quietly in his reading room, the faintest of smiles playing at the corner of his mouth, unreadable. The next morning, Mrs. Bennet resumed the conversation as if it had never paused. "I do wonder," she began, half sighing, "when you intend to visit Mr. Bingley. People will think us quite rude if you delay any longer." Mr. Bennet looked at her with that calm, exasperating indifference of his. "I'm afraid I have no acquaintance with the gentleman. Perhaps you and the girls might call on him yourselves." "Us? Surely not. A woman cannot take such a liberty. You know perfectly well it is your place to go first." "Is that so? What a pity. But no matter, I might send him a note instead. Or perhaps Kitty could run over there, if she manages to stop coughing for 5 minutes." A silence fell over the room. The girls stared. Mrs. Bennet opened her mouth, then closed it again. Mr. Bennet was teasing, certainly, but had he done something more? All that day, uncertainty hung in the air like fog. Hopes rose, fell, then rose again. And then, without drama or emphasis, as if mentioning nothing more than the weather, Mr. Bennet said, "Oh, I forgot. I visited Netherfield yesterday. Mr. Bingley seems a pleasant young man." The sitting room came alive in an instant. Joy broke through like sunlight. Mrs. Bennet very nearly wept. The daughters burst into questions. What did he say? Was he kind? Did he speak of us? But Mr. Bennet only smiled, that quiet, amused smile of his, and said little more. He left them to their guessing, their delight, their dreaming. Yet it was clear now, the door to Mr. Bingley had been opened, and with it, something delicate had begun, a thread, fine as silk, spun from a single quiet visit, already weaving the beginning of a story no one yet knew they were part of. A few days later, the opportunity Mrs. Bennet had long hoped for finally arrived. A ball to be held in Meryton, where the entire neighborhood would gather, and more importantly, where Mr. Bingley and his guests were expected to make their formal appearance. The Bennet family arrived at the assembly hall with a quiet sense of anticipation, and soon they saw him, Mr. Bingley, tall and warm in manner, his smile easy and sincere, bowing graciously to everyone he passed. There was a lightness in the air around him, as if his openness smoothed away all awkwardness. He moved easily through the crowd, kind and attentive, and it became quickly, wonderfully clear that Jane Bennet held his special notice. He invited her to dance not once, but twice. A gesture that, in a ball such as this, was enough to stir a glimmer of hope in every watchful mother in the room. But standing beside him was another man. So different in presence, it was as though shadow had followed light. Mr. Darcy. Tall, severe in expression, with a gaze that seemed to weigh rather than welcome, was less easily approached. Those unfamiliar with him were drawn at first by his appearance and his fortune, but the admiration faded almost as quickly as it had sparked. He made no effort to meet new acquaintances, offered no invitations to dance, and seemed entirely uninterested in pleasing anyone at all. Elizabeth Bennet, with her quick eyes and quiet smile, gave him little thought until, quite by chance, she heard his voice. One of his companions had suggested he ask her to dance. Darcy glanced toward her, then turned away and said, just loudly enough for her to hear, "She is tolerable, I suppose, but not handsome enough to tempt me." The words were cold, sharp as frost, and struck directly at her pride. Elizabeth showed nothing but a faint smile, calm and unbothered on the surface, yet something within her quietly shut. From that moment on, something subtle began, not affection, not yet, but a kind of caution and alertness. Elizabeth did not care for Mr. Darcy, but the carelessness of his words had drawn her attention more than she wished. And Darcy, though he did not ask her for a single dance that night, glanced her way more than once, as if already questioning the judgment he had so casually spoken aloud. After the ball, the subject of Mr. Bingley became the favorite of every tea table in the neighborhood. It was generally agreed that he was a most amiable gentleman, cheerful, well-mannered, and without the slightest trace of arrogance. But in the small house of the Bennet family, the real excitement came not from his wealth or manners, but from the fact that he had danced twice with Jane. And it was not merely the dancing. Throughout the evening, Bingley's eyes seemed drawn to Jane as though by instinct, and his voice, whenever he spoke to her, grew softer, warmer, almost unconsciously so. These little signs, delicate as they were, did not escape Mrs. Bennet, who in her heart had already begun imagining a wedding, though not a single promise had yet been spoken. Jane, true to her gentle nature, never allowed her feelings to show too easily. She simply said that Mr. Bingley was kind and pleasant to talk to, though her eyes lit up, ever so slightly, whenever she said his name. But Elizabeth, always perceptive, saw more. She knew something had stirred in her sister's heart. As for Elizabeth herself, her thoughts returned not to Bingley, but to his companion, Mr. Darcy, whose presence still lingered like a chill. The more she thought of him, the more she bristled at the memory of his cutting remark. He might be wealthy, he might even be handsome, but what gave him the right to judge others with such cold disdain? Yet even as she dismissed him, Elizabeth noticed something strange. In the few brief encounters that followed the ball, Mr. Darcy seemed to notice her, not openly, not warmly, but there were glances that lingered a moment too long, a quiet attentiveness that suggested something unspoken. And still, he said nothing. He made no approach, no gesture that suggested a wish to know her better. Elizabeth shared this with her friend, Charlotte Lucas, as though it were a joke. She laughed. "Perhaps he's deciding whether I've grown handsome enough to tempt him now." Her tone was light, teasing, part amusement, part scorn, but in truth, Elizabeth had already drawn her own conclusions. Mr. Bingley, friendly, open, engaging. Mr. Darcy, proud, distant, and altogether uninteresting. In the days following the ball, talk of Mr. Bingley had not yet quieted. His name passed warmly from one household to the next, always with praise. But another name, too, began to appear in conversations, not with admiration, but with irritation. Mr. Darcy, for all his fortune and fine appearance, had left behind a sense of pride that many found hard to overlook, and among those who noticed, none was more observant than Elizabeth Bennet. One afternoon, Elizabeth visited the Lucases, the Bennets' nearest and kindest neighbors. Sir William Lucas, once a tradesman and now a knight, was a gentle, easy-going man who lived simply with his wife and children. His eldest daughter, Charlotte, was Elizabeth's dearest friend. Charlotte was not beautiful, but she was wise, steady, and far more practical than Elizabeth in matters of the heart. The two friends sat side by side, sipping tea, while a soft autumn breeze drifted in from the garden. "Are you still upset about Mr. Darcy's comment?" Charlotte asked, half teasing, half curious. Elizabeth laughed lightly. "Upset? No, I find it amusing, really. He behaves as though the world isn't quite worthy of his presence." Charlotte tilted her head, thoughtful. "I suppose. With someone of his wealth and position, pride is hard to avoid. He probably isn't used to needing anyone's approval. It's not entirely his fault." Elizabeth shook her head gently. "I'm not asking for flattery, Charlotte, but there's such a thing as basic courtesy. One doesn't need to insult others to feel superior." Charlotte said nothing in reply. She didn't disagree, but neither did she fully share Elizabeth's view. To her, Darcy's manner was not so surprising, especially given the distance between their worlds. But Elizabeth had already formed an impression, and she had no intention of softening it any time soon. The conversation between them ended with a quiet sigh. Not quite disagreement, only a recognition that they saw the world through different eyes. And in that silence, something had settled. Of all the shifting opinions that swirled around Mr. Darcy, Elizabeth's remained firm. He was proud, cold, and altogether lacking the warmth that might have made her curious to know him better. Time drifted gently on, as though the quiet countryside of Hertfordshire moved to its own soft, unhurried rhythm. Yet, beneath that calm surface, feelings had begun to stir, especially between Jane Bennet and Mr. Bingley. Each time they met, Bingley's gaze sought out Jane with a tenderness that was no longer subtle. He often found reasons to be near her, to ask after her comfort, to listen with quiet attention to every word she said. Jane, ever modest and reserved, revealed little of her heart, but to any careful observer it was clear Bingley was already captivated. And yet, because she was so gentle, so guarded, he could not be certain whether his affections were returned. Charlotte Lucas noticed this. One afternoon, she leaned in and spoke softly to Elizabeth. "Jane ought to show her feelings a little more," she said. "If she keeps acting so cool, Bingley might believe she doesn't care for him at all." Elizabeth looked at her with mild surprise. "But that's just who Jane is. Kind, quiet, modest. Isn't that something to be admired?" Charlotte smiled faintly. "It is, but love, especially from a man, sometimes needs a little encouragement. If she waits too long without showing anything, she might lose him." Elizabeth said nothing at first. Charlotte was always so practical. She had a way of seeing the world as it was, not as one wished it to be. Elizabeth, by contrast, believed that true love would find its way, without strategy or performance. But elsewhere, something else had quietly begun. A change in Mr. Darcy. At first, he had remained distant, keeping himself separate from the warmth of others. But gradually, his eyes had begun to settle on Elizabeth, not with obvious affection, but with a reluctant attention he could not quite explain. She was not the most beautiful woman in the room, and yet there was something, the brightness in her eyes, the sharp wit in her words, the quiet energy in her every movement, that drew him in despite himself. He did not want to be drawn. He tried to push the thought away, and still, when she laughed, when she answered a remark with playful cleverness, he found himself listening more closely than he intended. Yet even so, bound by pride and the invisible divide between their worlds, he did nothing but watch, silent, distant. Elizabeth, for her part, remained unaware, or chose to be. To her, Darcy was still the same cold man who had once insulted her without hesitation. No amount of glances could erase that first impression. She paid him no mind. One afternoon, the two friends sat once again beneath the old tree. Elizabeth looked up, her eyes suddenly serious. "Could you truly live that way, Charlotte? Marry a man you don't love just because he fits the part?" Charlotte nodded gently. For many women, security matters more than feeling. Not all of us have the luxury of choosing with our hearts. Elizabeth said nothing right away. Something in those words brushed against her. Soft but sharp. Charlotte was not wrong. And yet, deep within her, Elizabeth knew this to be true. Without love, marriage would feel to her like a beautiful prison, silent, proper, and utterly empty. The good news arrived on a gentle morning, touched by soft sunlight. Jane had received an invitation to dine at Netherfield, in the company of Mr. Bingley's sisters. Mrs. Bennet, predictably, was delighted. But rather than simply sending Jane in the family carriage, she spoke in a low voice, almost conspiratorially. "The weather looks uncertain today. Perhaps you should ride on horseback. If it rains, they might ask you to stay the night." Jane, as always, did not argue. She accepted her mother's quiet suggestion with gentle grace, never suspecting that it was part of a small but deliberate scheme. And indeed, the rain came. Not a light drizzle, but heavy, sudden, and cold, sweeping across the fields in sheets. By the time Jane reached Netherfield, she was chilled through. Within hours, a fever had taken hold. Her throat ached, her head grew faint, and she was soon confined to bed, unable to return home. When the news reached Longbourn, Elizabeth's concern was real and immediate. Without waiting for a carriage, she gathered her skirts and set out on foot, walking 7 miles along muddy roads, through the damp green countryside, determined only to be with her sister. When she arrived at Netherfield and entered the drawing room, the effect was striking. Her dress was splattered with mud, her hair slightly tousled by the wind, her cheeks flushed with cold, and her eyes bright with worry. Yet there was something about her, unpolished but utterly alive, that made her more vivid than any carefully dressed lady in the room. Mr. Darcy looked at her and, for a moment, was caught off guard. He was not used to women like this. In his world, young ladies were composed, refined, and precise. Elizabeth was none of those things. And yet, she was not improper. There was a natural strength in her, a quiet vitality that made it difficult to look away. She had come for Jane, and cared nothing for who watched her. In conversation, she spoke plainly, with ease and confidence, seeking neither approval nor praise, and that, more than anything, unsettled Darcy. It intrigued him. He found himself noticing small details: the way her eyes moved across the room, the slight tilt of her smile when she made a clever remark, the calm assurance in her voice. At first, he told himself he was only observing, no more. But slowly, that quiet observation began to turn into something more. A gentle, growing attention he refused to name. Elizabeth, however, noticed none of this. To her, Netherfield was simply the house where her sister lay ill. Everything else, including Mr. Darcy, was of no consequence. Elizabeth remained at Netherfield for several days, tending to Jane with quiet devotion. She asked for nothing, drew no attention to herself, and yet, each time she entered the drawing room, dressed simply, moving with calm purpose, the air seemed to shift in some gentle, unspoken way. One evening, after Jane had begun to recover, Elizabeth was invited to dine with the household. Mr. Bingley, as ever, was warm and attentive. Mr. Darcy sat quietly, observing more than he spoke. And Bingley's 2 sisters, Caroline and Louisa, offered polite conversation, though their glances toward Elizabeth often carried a shade of silent judgment. Caroline Bingley, in particular, made little effort to conceal her disapproval. To her, Elizabeth was too informal, walking miles through the mud, caring for her sister without the help of servants, speaking too directly, too confidently, too little like a well-bred young lady. Elizabeth had done nothing improper, and yet, everything she did seemed, to Caroline, just slightly out of place. What unsettled Caroline most, however, was not Elizabeth's presence, but Mr. Darcy's reaction to it. The man she had long hoped to impress had begun to listen. Whenever Elizabeth spoke, Darcy would lift his head, his attention caught. He said little, but something in his gaze had changed. It no longer passed over Elizabeth, but lingered. With a quiet, thoughtful admiration, he did not speak aloud. Later that evening, the group sat gathered near the fire, the room filled with the soft hum of conversation. Caroline, her voice light but edged with meaning, turned to Darcy and asked, "Tell us, Mr. Darcy, what, in your view, makes an ideal woman?" Darcy paused, then replied slowly, "She must possess knowledge, elegance, good character, and a mind that is calm, yet keen. I have rarely seen all of these in one person." Caroline laughed. "Well then, sir, I fear you will never be satisfied. That is too much to expect from any woman." Darcy offered no further reply, but Elizabeth, seated slightly apart, glanced at him, part surprised, part skeptical. She could not forget what he had once said of her. "Not handsome enough to tempt me." And if he truly valued such qualities, then why had he spoken with such disdain? She remained composed, but the thought lingered, and yet it was Darcy who felt the deeper shift. Though he had not yet given it a name, he found himself quietly wondering, how could a woman he once dismissed so easily now occupy his thoughts so completely? The next morning, with Jane well enough to sit up, the atmosphere at Netherfield grew gentler. A quiet sense of ease began to return. But the calm did not last long. A carriage came rattling into the courtyard, unexpected, uninvited, carrying a guest no one in the house had anticipated, Mrs. Bennet. Dressed in bright colors and speaking with little restraint, she entered the room with an eager, unfiltered cheerfulness. At the sight of Jane reclining on the sofa, she exclaimed at once, "Heavens, my poor child, look so pale. And no one thought to send for me sooner? Still, this is all for the best. At least you are recovering in a respectable house." Elizabeth winced. Mr. Bingley remained gracious, as always. But Caroline Bingley's eyes narrowed with undisguised disdain, and Mr. Darcy stepped subtly back, his gaze calmly, carefully taking in every word and movement. Mrs. Bennet did not stop. She began to talk, and talk, filling the room with tales from the village, casual boasts about Jane's beauty and Elizabeth's cleverness, and thinly veiled praise for Mr. Bingley's excellent judgment. Her voice, unbothered by the silence around her, grew louder as she turned the conversation toward pride and manners. Then, glancing at Darcy with a knowing smile, she said, "Some people think themselves superior simply because they have money and a few acres of land. But I've always taught my girls to be humble, sir." Elizabeth felt her breath catch. A flush of embarrassment rose swiftly to her cheeks. Every word her mother spoke seemed to tug loose the delicate threads of dignity she had tried so carefully to preserve, especially in the eyes of those who, like Mr. Darcy, measured worth with quiet, invisible scales. No one responded, but the stillness in the room was its own kind of reply. When Mrs. Bennet finally left, talking all the way to the door, Elizabeth remained behind, heavy with unease. She knew her mother meant well, but the lack of subtlety, the disregard for how words might land, it left her aching with a quiet shame. She glanced toward Darcy. He stood apart, his expression unreadable, but in his eyes, dark and steady, there was something moving, silent but unmistakable, a shift in thought, a quiet reckoning. For Darcy, who had always seen the boundaries between classes as firm and fixed, the moment was clarifying. The distance between them had never been just wealth or position. It was also this, the difference between families who instinctively understood what to leave unsaid, and those who did not. After Mrs. Bennet's departure, the air within the house slowly settled into calm once more. Jane continued to recover, her cheeks growing pink again, her soft smile no longer shadowed by weariness. But Elizabeth still carried a quiet weight within her. Not concern for Jane, but a lingering unease over the impression her family might have left upon the residents of Netherfield. In the evenings that followed, Elizabeth often found herself sitting in the drawing room with Mr. Bingley, Mr. Darcy, and Caroline Bingley. Jane, needing rest, retired early, leaving Elizabeth to navigate conversations that, while civil on the surface, often carried subtler undercurrents. One evening, the discussion turned toward pride and moral character. Mr. Bingley, ever amiable, confessed that he preferred to trust in people's better nature. If proven wrong, he said with a smile, he was quick to admit his error, sometimes too quick, even changing his mind just because someone had spoken persuasively. Darcy, by contrast, was measured, his voice slow and certain. "I take pride," he said, "in not altering my opinions lightly. When I believe something to be right, I hold to it, regardless of persuasion." Elizabeth tilted her head and smiled gently. Then perhaps pride at times is mistaken for loyalty to oneself. Darcy looked at her for a long moment before replying, "I believe pride can be just when it arises from a clear understanding of one's own worth." At this, Caroline Bingley's voice floated into the room, soft and sweet, but edged with thorns. "Of course, there are those who believe that speaking bluntly is a sign of cleverness. But I do wonder whether excessive candor is ever truly admirable." Though no name was mentioned, her glance was unmistakably aimed at Elizabeth. Yet Elizabeth did not flinch. She merely smiled, calm, unbothered, and her composure seemed only to deepen Caroline's irritation. Darcy, seated not far away, saw everything. He said nothing in her defense, but inside something was shifting. Elizabeth was not dazzling in the conventional sense. She had no fortune, no polished charm, no desire to please. But she was intelligent, poised, and unafraid of judgment. He tried to resist it, reminding himself of her family, of her social standing, of everything he had overheard from her mother and the village. But then he looked at her again, at the brightness in her eyes, the quiet mischief in her smile, and something in him stirred, almost against his will. Meanwhile, Jane had nearly recovered. That morning, Elizabeth stood beside her bed, gently adjusting the shawl over her sister's shoulders. Though Jane had improved, she was still weak and needed a few more days of rest. Elizabeth remained at Netherfield to care for her, and as the days passed, she became a quiet presence in the house, no longer merely a guest, yet not quite a member of the household either. Evenings fell gently, with the soft flicker of lamplight and the faint scent of tea drifting through the drawing room. There, Elizabeth would often sit quietly, sometimes with a book in her hands, sometimes engaged in conversation. She did not seek to charm, did not try to impress, and paid little mind to the thinly veiled scrutiny that often flickered across Caroline Bingley's face. And yet, it was that very lack of effort that drew Darcy in more and more. He saw in her a rare composure. Elizabeth was neither submissive nor haughty. She knew how to smile at a sly remark and respond with a wit so calm and precise it left no room for retaliation. She had no desire to be noticed, and for that very reason he found it harder and harder to look away. Caroline, already uneasy, now grew quietly resentful. Each time Elizabeth spoke, Caroline would interject, correcting, deflecting, or releasing a feather-light comment so sharp it could scarcely be ignored. She spoke often of fashion, of acquaintances in London, of grand balls, and even grander estates, topics she believed lay beyond Elizabeth's reach. But Elizabeth remained unruffled. She listened with grace, answering at times with a short, clever remark, so effortlessly amusing that even Bingley would burst into laughter. Darcy did not laugh, but his gaze lingered, thoughtful and unwavering, on every word she said. One evening, as the conversation turned to books, Caroline leaned back and murmured sweetly, "I so admire women of intellect like Elizabeth. They seem quite singular." Her tone was gentle, almost admiring, but Elizabeth caught the undercurrent. She narrowed her eyes slightly, as if choosing whether to respond at all. Then she said, without haste, "Sometimes people speak of intellect as if it were rare, only because they are not used to seeing it." Darcy said nothing, but inside, he could not help but admire her. She was not merely intelligent. She defended her dignity with a grace that refused to beg for approval. It stirred something in him, something quiet and unsettling. He found himself uneasy. Each time he tried to turn his attention elsewhere, something pulled him back to her. And because of that pull, he grew cautious. He offered no compliments, made no effort to be near her, but in the glance that lingered too long, in the silence that followed her words, something had shifted. Elizabeth, though aware of his gaze, a few days later, the skies cleared. The autumn wind had softened, and a gentle flush of pink had returned to Jane's cheeks. She sat by the window with a quiet smile, folding the woolen scarf their mother had sent, her voice calm and content as she said to Elizabeth, "You know, even though I've been unwell, I've truly enjoyed staying here." Elizabeth nodded, gazing at her sister with fondness. She understood the source of that quiet happiness and the person who had stirred something in Jane's heart, softly and without a word. But she also knew that nothing should be prolonged more than necessary. Once the doctor assured them Jane was well enough to return, Elizabeth began preparing for their departure without delay. The morning they left, the house seemed to move a little more slowly. Mr. Bingley came to the door himself, his voice tinged with genuine regret. "Had I known you weren't quite recovered, I might have insisted on another day." Jane simply smiled in thanks, warm but unpromising. Elizabeth watched in silence, not wishing to interfere in something so delicately undefined. Still, she couldn't help but notice the way Bingley looked at Jane. Gentle, hopeful, as though waiting for something unspoken. Caroline Bingley also came to see them off, wearing her most carefully arranged smile. She turned to Jane with easy charm, offered Elizabeth a few polite phrases, then took Jane's hand and said, almost confidingly, "We shall miss you dearly. I do hope you'll visit Netherfield again very soon." Elizabeth heard the words, but they left her cold, not because of what was said, but because of how softly, too softly, they were spoken. There was something too polished in Caroline's tone. No overt malice, only a thin layer hiding something subtler, something more calculating. As the carriage began to move, Elizabeth turned back for one last glance at Netherfield. The house grew smaller, retreating behind rows of trees, but in her heart, fragments remained. Darcy's quiet gaze, footsteps echoing in distant halls, and conversations laced with meaning left unspoken. She found herself wondering, had something shifted in those days at Netherfield? Not just in others, but perhaps in herself? But then she shook her head, gently, as if brushing the thought aside. However Darcy might have looked at her, she still remembered too clearly the chill of his first dismissal, and the firm belief, deep and quiet, that between them stretched a distance that had no name. When Elizabeth and Jane returned to Longbourn, life seemed to slip back into its familiar rhythm. afternoon tea, the fading roses of late autumn, and Mrs. Bennet's ever-animated voice, especially whenever Mr. Bingley was mentioned. But peace had barely settled when an unexpected letter arrived from a distant relation named Mr. Collins, and stirred the household in an oddly animated way. Mr. Bennet, holding the letter, read it aloud with a barely concealed smirk. The letter was long, rambling, adorned with grandiose phrases and an excess of formal courtesies so exaggerated they bordered on comical. Yet what captured everyone's attention was Mr. Collins's declaration. He intended to visit them shortly, in a spirit of reconciliation and atonement, given that he was to inherit their estate someday. He was the son of a distant cousin, and due to the laws of entailment, the entirety of Longbourn would one day belong to him, not to the Bennet daughters. One might expect guilt. Instead, he wrote, "I trust that by marrying one of your daughters, I may alleviate the inconvenience which my inheritance may cause your family." Elizabeth nearly laughed aloud. Jane, ever more composed, merely murmured that it was rather odd, but Mrs. Bennet, seizing the idea with unfiltered enthusiasm, exclaimed, "If he's willing to marry Lizzie, we shall keep Longbourn in the family after all." Elizabeth flushed. "Mamma, I haven't even met him." "All the better," Mrs. Bennet declared with certainty. "The less you know, the easier it is to fall in love." And so, a few days later, Mr. Collins did indeed arrive, tall and awkward, with sloping shoulders and an expression that constantly sought approval in others' eyes. His speech was excessively polished in the strangest way. His bows were far too deep, and nearly every sentence was laced with reverence for his noble patroness, Lady Catherine de Bourgh. "Lady Catherine has most graciously allowed me to take leave for several days to visit your esteemed household," he declared with reverent pride. "She is truly a woman whom modern society ought to admire, noble, discerning, and with exceptional taste in window drapery." Elizabeth had to bite her lip to keep from laughing. The more Mr. Collins spoke, the more his peculiar blend of naive self-importance, obsequious flattery, and rigid moralism revealed itself, at times, almost endearingly absurd. He wandered about the house as though already surveying his future inheritance, and whenever he spoke to one of the Bennet daughters, he made an effort to be attentive, but the result was only an uncomfortable awkwardness that made others embarrassed. That evening, dinner was prepared with more care than usual, not because of the presence of an honored guest, but simply because Mr. Collins was there. Mrs. Bennet could hardly contain herself, constantly instructing her daughters to speak gently, don't do anything to offend him, while Elizabeth found herself suppressing a smile at the thought of dining with the man her mother had already imagined as her future husband. Mr. Collins approached the dinner table with the solemnity of someone about to deliver a speech in Parliament. The moment he was seated, he began, presenting. "It is a rare privilege," he began, "for me, a humble clergyman, under the esteemed patronage of Lady Catherine de Bourgh, to be welcomed into such a hospitable home." Everyone offered polite, if slightly strained smiles, but he did not stop. "Lady Catherine," he went on, "is a woman of remarkable intelligence. She personally selected the curtains for my drawing room, a soft green, most compatible with the carpet, and she advised me to choose a porcelain dinner set with a peach blossom motif instead of the coarser earthenware. Her attention to such matters is truly admirable." Mr. Bennet, with the faintest edge of mischief in his voice, something only Elizabeth caught, remarked, "It seems, sir, that you are fortunate indeed to receive guidance even in the smallest domestic details." Mr. Collins beamed, missing the irony entirely. "Indeed, I believe it is proper for those of lower standing to show gratitude to their superiors, even in the choice of cutlery." Mrs. Bennet, seated beside him, looked radiant, as though every mention of Lady Catherine was a veiled proposal. Jane remained gracious as ever. Lydia let out the occasional giggle, and Elizabeth began to pity herself. If this was the man her mother envisioned for her, the future seemed bleak indeed. As the meal neared its end, Mr. Collins laid down his fork with the air of someone about to make a declaration. He cleared his throat and said, as though revealing a revelation, "Since I shall be staying for several days, I think it only sensible to observe carefully, so that I may determine which of the young ladies would be the most suitable object of my affections." The room stilled for a moment. Elizabeth bit her lip to keep from saying something she would regret. Mr. Bennet calmly poured himself another glass of wine. Mrs. Bennet, on the other hand, all but sparkled. "Of course, sir. Take your time. I am certain all my daughters would be most grateful for your kind attention." Elizabeth stared down at her plate, unsure whether to laugh or sigh. Mr. Collins, clearly convinced that he was about to bestow a great honor, raised his... After a long, drawn-out evening, filled with Mr. Collins's endless praises of Lady Catherine, Elizabeth felt an undeniable need to breathe. Something real. So when Lydia and Kitty eagerly invited her to walk down to Meryton, where a newly stationed regiment was quartered, she accepted at once. Not out of interest in officers, but from a deep desire to escape the hovering atmosphere of impending proposals at home. The cobbled street echoed with the brisk steps of soldiers. Lydia and Kitty could hardly contain their excitement as they mingled with the newly arrived men, all smart in their red coats, shoulders square, and smiles quick to appear. But just as the chatter was reaching a lively hum, a man stepped forward who made all three girls pause for a brief, breath-held moment. Mr. Wickham. He appeared as though he had just stepped out of a romantic tale. Tall, strikingly handsome, his features open and clear, his eyes kind but quietly discerning. Most of all, it was his smile, warm and unforced, that made the person he looked at feel suddenly seen. He began talking with ease, his voice low and pleasant, his manner natural and without the stiff formality Elizabeth had come to expect from men like Mr. Collins, or the pride she believed she had witnessed in Mr. Darcy. With just a few exchanged sentences, she felt drawn in. There was something in the way Wickham noticed things, lightly, wittily, that pulled her attention like a current. He seemed a world apart from the rigid, heavy silences that had lately surrounded her. But as they were speaking, a large carriage rolled past, and seated inside was none other than Mr. Darcy. Their eyes met, Wickham's and Darcy's. Darcy gave a slight nod, his expression hard as stone. Wickham, for a moment, changed. The light in his eyes dimmed, the easy smile faltered. He gave a brief, almost invisible bow, then turned away quickly. Elizabeth saw it, saw everything, and felt curious. What lay between these two? She did not ask, not yet. But from that moment on, something began to stir in her mind, quiet but persistent. Wickham, though composed, clearly bore some unease at the mention or sight of Darcy. And Darcy, as always, offered no explanation, keeping his distance as though that were answer enough. That evening, as Elizabeth returned home, her thoughts felt strangely unsettled, like she had stepped into a story deeper than it first appeared. One man was aloof, the other utterly charming, and between them, something. And that brings part 1 to a close. I'll see you in part 2. Thank you for listening. May the Lord bless you and keep you tonight. May his face shine upon you as you sleep, and may you wake up refreshed in his endless love. Good night, and sleep in his peace.